Chapter 1. Coming to England. My name is Carol Sanders. I live in England now, but when I was younger, I lived in Hong Kong. My father was a businessman there, and my mother worked as a secretary. We lived in Hong Kong for 7 years. I was happy at school, with lots of friends, and we had a good time. I like pop music. The Rolling Stones, David Bowie, and Jake Rosso were my favourites. Jake Rosso was my favourite singer. He died in a car accident the year I left school. But I listened to his pop records all the time. I had hundreds of pictures and photos of him on my bedroom wall. Then one day in winter, when I was 17, things began to go wrong for me. My father went to Australia on business. I loved him very much and didn't like him going away. "Come home quickly," I always said to him. He was in Australia for 2 weeks. Then on the day of his journey home, an aeroplane from Sydney crashed into the sea just south of Hong Kong. Everybody on the plane died. I heard about the plane crash on television. At first, I did not think about my father. Then I remembered he was flying back from Sydney on that day. "Oh no!" I cried. I telephoned the airport, but they did not know the names of all the passengers then. Perhaps my father didn't get that plane, I thought. Oh, please, please. My mother was at work, and I called her on the telephone. She came home quickly, and we went to the airport and waited for news. Later, we learned my father was on the plane. "It's not true!" I shouted. But it was true, and I began to cry. I cried for weeks and weeks. I spent many days alone in my room. I was lonely and sad, and I wanted to die too. I stopped going out with my friends. I didn't want to see other people. I stopped listening to Jake Rosso's records and took his pictures off my bedroom wall. I didn't listen to music or watch television. Nothing mattered any more. Then I stopped crying. I stopped feeling sad and began to feel angry. Why did it happen to him? I asked my mother. Why do the best people die? Jake Rosso, my father. I don't know, Carol, my mother said. She was unhappy too. At the time of the plane crash, I was a student at college. I enjoyed the work and college life very much. But after my father's death, I stopped doing my work at the college. I began to go out with some new friends. They were different from my other friends, and my mother didn't like them. "They're bad people, Carol," she told me. "They do dangerous things." "They're exciting," I said, "and I like them." I knew she was angry, but I didn't care. But then I learned my new friends took drugs and I began to take drugs too. It was wrong and stupid. I know that now. But I was unhappy and angry. The police came to the college to arrest some of the students. They didn't arrest me, but I had to leave the college. It was a bad time. My mother was very unhappy with me. "What am I going to do with you, Carol?" she said. "I'm sorry," I told her. "We'll go back to England," she said. "You can find a college there. Perhaps you can be happier in England." "All right," I said. "I want to forget what's happened. I want to forget what I've done and begin a new life, be a new person." A month later, we came back to England. We lived in London, in a hotel. It was strange at first, with all the red buses and everybody speaking English. It was the beginning of the summer, 3 months before college began in the autumn. London was full of tourists. We looked at all the famous buildings: Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, and we went to restaurants and theatres in the evenings. It was interesting and exciting, and I began to forget the bad times in Hong Kong. "I'm pleased we came to London," I told my mother. But after a few weeks, she said, "You need to find a college, Carol. You must go on studying. And I need a job." That evening, we looked in the newspapers. "What about this?" I said. I showed my mother a job in the newspaper. Secretary for the summer months on a small private island in Scotland. Live with the family in a big house. Interesting work and good pay for the right person. Phone Greta Ross, telephone number 071. "Well, that sounds interesting," said my mother. "I'd like to work as a secretary on an island in Scotland. It's a beautiful country, Carol, and you can go to college there in the autumn. And it's a place to live for the summer," I said. "Hotels are expensive." My mother telephoned Greta Ross. "Come and see me tomorrow," Greta Ross told her. "Come to the Savoy Hotel at 11 o'clock. I went to the Savoy Hotel with my mother. It was big and expensive, bigger than our hotel, and in the centre of London. Mum needs this job, I thought, and a private island in Scotland is a nice place to live. Perhaps I can forget what's happened if I go there. "Room 22, said the woman at the hotel desk. "Go on up. Mrs. Ross will see you now." Greta Ross was waiting for us. She was about 30 years old and very beautiful. She wore an expensive red dress, and her hair was very long and dark. "This is my daughter Carol," said my mother. "Hello, Carol," said Greta Ross. "Hello," I said. "Carol is 18 years old," said my mother. "Can she come with me if I get the job? Perhaps she can help in the house or in the gardens. She likes gardening. She's studying farming at college." "Perhaps," said Greta Ross. "There's a small farm on the island." "I'd like to work on the farm," I said. Greta Ross looked at my mother. How long did you live in Hong Kong, Mrs. Sanders? 7 years, answered my mother. My husband died in a plane crash last year, so we've come back to live in England. Where did you live before Hong Kong? We lived in India for 3 years. Then Greta Ross took my mother into a room and asked her more questions. I waited outside. Greta Ross is nice, I thought. I hope my mother gets the job. Soon after, the door opened and my mother came out. She was smiling. Greta Ross said, "Please wait here for a minute, Mrs. Sanders. I want to make a phone call." She went back into the room and closed the door. I was sitting on a chair near the door, and I could just hear Greta Ross's voice speaking on the phone. "I think I've found someone," she was saying. "She has a daughter, but the girl can work in the garden or on the farm. Don't worry. They've been away from England for 10 years. It'll be all right, I tell you. Don't worry." After a few minutes, Greta Ross put down the phone and came out of the room. "You've got the job," she told my mother. My mother was pleased. "Thank you," she replied. I was pleased too, but now I was worried about that phone call. I didn't understand it. Chapter 2. The Island. We went to Scotland the next day. First by plane, then by train. Greta Ross travelled with us. I looked out of the train window and saw fields and villages and mountains. Mum is right, I thought. Scotland is a very beautiful place. "You're going to be my husband's secretary," Greta Ross told my mother. "He's a businessman, but he never leaves the island. He does all his work by telephone and letter and computer. He invests money in companies all over the world." "Do many people live on the island?" I asked. "Not many," said Greta Ross. "You'll meet them soon." Greta Ross is young, I thought. Is her husband young too? How can a young man buy an island? Is he very rich? After the train, we went on Mr. Ross's boat, which took us out to the island. The boatman was a young man. He had dark hair and was brown from the sun. "This is Tony," said Greta Ross. "He works for Mr. Ross." "Hi," said Tony. Soon we were near the island. I could see the beaches and the cliffs. The boat slowed down. "There are dangerous rocks round the island," explained Tony. "A lot of them are under the water, and you can't see them. I have to be careful. But the rocks keep other boats away, and that pleases Mr. Ross." "Why?" I asked. Tony looked at Greta Ross, but she wasn't listening. "Mr. Ross doesn't like visitors to the island," Tony said in a quiet voice. Then Greta Ross looked at us, and Tony said no more. Why doesn't Mr. Ross like visitors? I thought. Has he something to hide? When we arrived on the island, my mother and I followed Greta up to the house. It was very big, and there were trees all around it. A woman was waiting inside the house. "This is Mrs. Duncan, Tony's mother," said Greta. "She's the housekeeper, and her husband is the gardener. Mrs. Duncan will take you up to your rooms. I'm going to tell Mr. Ross you've arrived." The housekeeper was a little woman with short hair. She went up the stairs, and my mother and I went after her. My room was next to my mother's. I looked out of the window and saw the gardens at the back of the house. A man was working in the garden near some trees. "Is that Mr. Duncan?" I thought. I looked between the trees and saw the sea. It's a beautiful house and a beautiful island. That evening, we had dinner with Mr. and Mrs. Duncan and Tony. We ate in the big kitchen. "What happened to Mr. Ross's last secretary?" asked my mother. "She's in hospital," replied Mrs. Duncan. "She's going to be away all summer." "Isn't Mrs. Ross lonely here?" I said. "No," said Mrs. Duncan. "She likes painting a lot. She has a room upstairs and goes there to paint. She's very good. Sometimes she goes to different places on the island to paint pictures." We finished eating our meal. Soon after, Greta Ross came into the kitchen. "Mr. Ross wants to see you and your daughter now, Mrs. Saunders," she said. "Follow me, please." We followed her through the house and into a big room. This was Mr. Ross's office, and he was sitting behind a desk. I was surprised. He was a young man, about 30. He had a moustache, short dark hair, and he wore glasses. Mr. Ross was speaking into the telephone. Who does he look like? I thought. Is it Tony Duncan? "Mr. Ross is talking to a business friend in New York," said Greta. "Please sit down." While we waited, I looked around the office. There were 3 telephones, a computer, and lots of books and papers. There was another door, and I could see a smaller room next to the office. There was a smaller desk and another computer in there. Mr. Ross finished speaking on the phone, then looked carefully at my mother and me. For a few seconds, he didn't speak, and just watched us. Then he said, "I'm pleased to meet you, Mrs. Saunders. I need some help with my work. My secretary is in hospital, and there's a lot of work to do. Sometimes you'll have to work late at night because of time differences in New York and Tokyo. Is that all right?" "Yes, that's all right," said my mother. "Can you use a computer?" "Yes." "Good." He looked at me. "Is this your daughter?" "Yes, this is Carol," said my mother. "Hello," I said. "Greta says you like gardening. There's a big garden here, so you can help Mr. Duncan. And there's a farm. Dan and Stella Parks live in the farmhouse and work on the farm. You can help them too. We have some animals. Some sheep, a few cows, and chickens. And there's a horse called Smoke. He's grey, like his name. Can you ride?" "Yes," I said. "I can ride a horse." "You can ride Smoke around the island, if you like." "I'd like that," I said. "Thank you." "And we grow vegetables and fruit," he said. I work on the farm sometimes. I enjoy it. I smiled at him, but he didn't smile back. Carol will enjoy working on the farm, said my mother. Won't you, Carol? Yes, I said. Mr. Ross looks sad, I thought. But how did he get all his money? And why does he hide away on an island? Chapter 3. The Photograph. I worked in the garden for the first 2 days. The weather was hot and sunny. I liked working with Mr. Duncan, and he was pleased with my work. You're a good gardener, he said. I've always liked gardening, I said, but I'm studying at college to be a farmer. Sometimes I saw Greta Ross. She likes to be alone, I thought. Once or twice, I saw Greta go out with her painting things. She went up on the hills or down to the beach. Mr. Duncan took me to the farm, and I met Dan and Stella Parks. They were very friendly. You can work on the farm for the next 3 days, said Dan Parks. Mr. Duncan says you're a good gardener. Are you a good farmer too? I smiled at him. I am, I said. He smiled back. So I worked on the farm with Mr. and Mrs. Parks. They were nice people. I helped with the cows and the chickens and went up on the hills with Mr. Parks and his dog to look at the sheep. One afternoon, I went out riding. Smoke was a big, lazy, friendly horse. I enjoyed riding, and Smoke knew his way around the island very well. I learned new places to go to. I rode along the cliff top and then in between some trees. When we came out of the trees, I saw the house from the other side. I tried to find the window of my room. Which one was it? Suddenly, I saw a face at one of the windows. The face was looking at me. It was there for just a second or two, then it moved away quickly. Who was that? I thought. Was it Mr. Ross? And which room was it? I didn't see my mother very much that first week. She worked all day and in the evenings. She wrote letters to South America, Japan, Canada, and Australia. Sometimes she worked after I was in bed. Mr. Ross works hard, she told me. He invests money in many companies and countries, but it's not his money. It's not. I was surprised by this. No, it's his wife's money, and she bought the island. It's her island, her house, her farm. Everything belongs to her. How strange. But why does Mr. Ross always look sad? And why does he never leave the island? I asked. I don't know, said my mother. He says he likes it here and likes working on his farm. It's strange, I know. Sometimes, when I finished work, I walked along the beaches or the cliffs, or I went swimming in the sea. I liked swimming. Greta Ross often came to the beach to swim, but Mr. Ross never came. Stay away from the rocks, Carol, Greta Ross told me. They're very dangerous. I will, I said. Sometimes I took my camera to the beach and took photographs of some of the boats that went by. I took photographs of the birds on the cliffs. There were other small islands near our island, and boats with tourists stopped at them. But no boats stopped at our island. They kept away from the dangerous rocks. Tony was right. The island did not have visitors.